Good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And on behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and all of us here, it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for the first of 3 Huggins lectures to be delivered by Dr. Ryan Hanley on Robert Wedderburn's Insurrectionary British Atlantic. First, a housekeeping detail. Today's lecture will be delivered entirely on Zoom. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And I realize I just said that as if you haven't done this a million times over the last couple of years, but we're used to being hybrid, but today we're virtual. But do keep in mind that tomorrow's and Wednesday's lectures by Dr. Hanley can be attended in person at the Barker Center at 12 Quincy Street in Cambridge or on Zoom. And we welcome your presence at either of those. Now, let me take a moment to say a few words about Professor Walter Johnson, who will introduce Dr. Hanley. Walter Johnson is Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard. He earned his PhD at Princeton, a postgraduate diploma in history at University of Cambridge, and his BA at Amherst College. However, I think it says more about him that his own official biography leads with the fact that he grew up in Columbia, Missouri, and is a member of the Rockbridge High School Hall of Fame, 2006. His prize-winning books, Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market, and River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Mississippi Valley's Cotton Kingdom, were published by Harvard University Press. His autobiographical essay, Guns in the Family, was included in the 2019 edition of Best American Essays, and his most recent book is The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. Professor Johnson is a founding member of the Commonwealth Project, which brings together academics, artists, and activists in an effort to imagine, foster, and support revolutionary social change, beginning in St. Louis. And I should note that a few years ago, Professor Johnson was very heavily involved in bringing one of our fellows to the Hip Hop Archive, or to one of our NAS fellows to the Hip Hop Archive, the hip hop artist and activist Tef Poe. So we enjoy a very productive relationship with Professor Johnson. So thank you for that. Please join me in welcoming Professor Walter Johnson to the Hutchins Center this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for that that very nice introduction and that resounding Zoom welcome. The Zoom welcome is a little bit like the feeling of Wile E. Coyote out over the the edge. Like, well, is there really anybody out there? But it's nice to be here, and I'm really excited to get to introduce Ryan Hanley. And I think that you all are going to understand why I am so excited at the end of this 50 minutes. I did tell Ryan, Dr. Hanley, that I have to leave about 5:30 to pick up my son, and so there is no disrespect signaled or intended in my leaving. Ryan Hanley is a lecturer in modern British history at the University of Exeter. His work explores the contributions of people of African descent to political, social, and cultural life in the 18th and 19th century Britain, including but extending well beyond the questions of slavery and abolition. His first book, Beyond Slavery and Abolition, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And with Katie Donington and Jessica Moody, he has co-edited Britain's History and Memory of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and that was published in 2016. He's published widely in a number of journals, including Slavery and Abolition, Transactions of the Royal Historical Society, and he is the only historian ever to win both the Alexander Prize for the best first article in British history in 2016, and the Whitfield Prize for the best first monograph on British history in 2019, both awarded by the Royal Historical Society. So it's important to note that Ryan here today has the stamp of approval from the Queen. He is currently working on a book which explores the role of race and slavery in the construction of British working class identity from 1787 to 1838. And so let's give that warm Hutchins Center Zoom welcome to Ryan Hanley.
Thanks, Walter. It's really lovely to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen, and I'm just going to assume that it works unless somebody stops me. Okay. So I've given each of these lectures these little one-word subtitles here, and these really reflect a kind of theme that seems to sort of emerge to me in the process of writing this new kind of biography of the Jamaican-Scottish insurrectionary British radical Robert Wedderburn, rather than a kind of intentional argument, although hopefully it will all seem sort of at least partly intentional as we go through. So, Barbarity to a Female Slave was the understated title John Fairbairn gave to his little four-penny slavery pamphlet. He had pulled it together from House of Commons reports and spiced it up for the cheaper end of the market with a liberal application of exclamation marks and extra emphasis on the gory details. The pamphlet joined a small but growing subgenre of rather exploitative slavery torture literature produced cheaply and quickly for a mass readership in London. The low price point of this type of literature meant that almost anyone could afford it, and as such, it represented an important, if officially unacknowledged, means of spreading anti-slavery sentiment among the poor. Competition for hard-up customers' cash was fierce at this end of the market, and so Fairbairn had decided to set Barbarity to a Female Slave apart by adding a lurid, hand-coloured etching depicting a heavily pregnant woman staked out on the ground and being flogged. We can only guess what Fairbairn thought his readers would want to do with such a graphic and distressing image once they brought it home. Now, Robert Wedderburn was exactly the sort of customer that Fairbairn would have had in mind for his little four-penny pamphlet. Wedderburn had always been a poor man, but he'd managed to eke out an independent living as a tailor, catering to similarly poor clientele in the St Giles area of London. He was one of the oldest members of the so-called St Giles Blackbirds, a community of black men and their families living locally. These were predominantly veterans who had been either emancipated or had escaped slavery by fighting for the British during the American Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. Wedderburn was very politically engaged. In fact, he was one of the leading figures in what Ian McCalman called London's ultra-radical underworld, a self-consciously unrespectable group of working-class agitators for political revolution. Wedderburn had been making a bit of a name for himself for going further than other radicals dared, especially when the topic of slavery was mentioned. He'd seen the nightmare of it for himself, having grown up on a Jamaican plantation, the child of an enslaved woman named Rosanna and her one-time master, James Wedderburn. But if he passed by John Fairbairn's little shop at Ludgate Hill, about 15 minutes walk from his house, the illustration for Barbarity to a Female Slave would surely have grabbed his attention. He had witnessed nearly this exact scene for himself when, as a child of 8 or 9, he watched as his heavily pregnant mother was stretched out on the ground and flogged in exactly the same way. This practice was neither new nor unusual in Jamaica. In 1790, a parliamentary select committee on the slave trade had heard testimony detailing the physical punishment of enslaved women in this very distinctive manner. When John Giles had travelled there in the 1780s, for instance, he recalled how, quote, when they were so far advanced in pregnancy that the size of the belly prevented them from being stretched flat upon the ground, I have understood that a hole has sometimes been dug to receive the belly. Abolitionist literature, both the cheap material like Fairbairn's account and the more expensive print culture sponsored by the anti-slavery societies, focused obsessively on the physical punishment inflicted on the naked bodies of enslaved women. The idea was that such a focus would incite particular moral outrage in the reader, but As a number of scholars, including Marisa Fuentes, Sasha Turner, and Enrica Altink have pointed out, the constant reproduction of almost pornographic images of enslaved women's violated and tortured bodies left little room for them to emerge in abolitionist discourse as anything other than vectors for white sensibility. As Fuentes explains in Dispossessed Lives, her brilliant meditation on the epistemic violence of the colonial archive, quote, enslaved women's experiences of violence are often alleged to be exaggerated by abolitionists, spectacular and sexualized by the male witnesses, in part because the violence exceeds our ability to reach the enslaved female subjects beyond their terror. While it's not possible to avoid reproducing the violence of slavery and the archive if one wants to account for violated lives, we can at least interrogate the meaning and consequences of such images. Writing of our ethical responsibilities as historians towards the enslaved women whose histories we seek to recover, both Fuentes and Sadia Hartman encourage us to consider the extent to which our work is in service of redress for the injustices both inscribed and constantly reenacted in these images of helplessness and degradation. Perhaps Wedderburn had something similar in mind when he sat down just a few weeks after Fairbairn's illustration was published to testify to what he had witnessed in Jamaica. Addressing by name the man who had ordered Rosanna's flogging in this way, his palpable rage strained the limits of written grammar as he sought to fix in place every contested detail of this sordid outrage. My heart glows with revenge and I cannot forgive, he wrote. O Boswell, ought not your colour and countrymen be visited with wrath for flogging my mother before my face at the time when she was far advanced in pregnancy? What was her crime? Did you not give her leave to visit her aged mother? She did not acquaint her mistress at her departure. This was her fault, but it originated in your crime in holding her as a slave. Could not you wait till she returned, but travel 15 miles to punish her on that visit? Note here that Wedderburn made no attempt to apologize for his mother's supposed fault in breaking the rules set by her mistress. Indeed, Rosanna appears here not as an inarticulate violated victim that we see in Fairbairn's illustration, but as a person who makes decisions, and decisions that embroil her unjustly in a complex negotiation over the limits of her freedom of movement and action. The messiness of Wedderburn's account and its failure to adhere to a kind of standardized English grammar hints at the possibility of another kind of narrative about violence towards enslaved women, one with the potential to move beyond a simple reproduction of trauma for sympathetic metropolitan eyes. Now, this short passage, which appeared in the first issue of Wedderburn's 1817 radical periodical, The Axilla to the Root, was the first time, as far as we know, that he sought to set the record straight regarding his mother and her capacity to act for herself. The contested and complicated circumstances surrounding the violence he witnessed against Rosanna and also against his grandmother, the Kingston Obeah woman, Talkee Amy, were subjects to which he would return frequently throughout a writing career that spanned 3 decades. Taken together, these accounts form a kind of radical counter-archive, a rebuke to both colonialist and abolitionist records' claims to absolute textual authority. Most fully in his 1824 account, The Horrors of Slavery, Wedderburn reconstructed an alternative history of the family in which the complex subjectivities of both his mother and grandmother could be glimpsed. Of course, like all archives, Wedderburn's accounts are themselves a form of knowledge production in which memory is fixed in a particular shape and ascribed a particular meaning for quite specific, historically defined purposes. But the difference between Wedderburn's accounts and most other forms of archival material about enslaved women's lives in the 18th century Caribbean is that the women being represented here played a meaningful part in the selection and addition of the forms of absolute truth to which these texts lay claim. The Horrors of Slavery is not, as it is often mistakenly called, a memoir. Indeed, it contains next to no information about Wedderburn himself, and like the first half of Tristram Shandy, most of the events it describes took place long before Wedderburn was even born. While Wedderburn's accounts prove remarkably accurate and verifiable in terms of detail, they are nevertheless, at least in part, translations of the memories of his mother and grandmother, filtered through his own deliberately confrontational anti-slavery politics. The consistency with which he was able to repeat certain details from Rosanna and Amy's lives to which he was not a personal witness indicate that these were shared family stories, reinforced in his memory by a mixture of repeated retellings and retellings by the women who raised him and inspired his rebellious and outspoken political worldview, and the immense emotional effort undertaken by Wedderburn to publicly bear witness to what they had endured. For the rest of my time today, I want to use this Radical CounterArchive as my starting point in an exploration of Rosanna and Amy's experiences in Jamaica during the 1760s and 1770s in the aftermath of the largest slave insurrection of the 18th century, Tacky's Revolt, which we now know after Vincent Brown's excellent recent book as Tacky's War. The Black feminist scholars I've just mentioned have all provided us with new ways to, in Anne Laura Stoller's words, read along the grain of both the colonial and abolitionist archive, zeroing in on what is left unsaid to center enslaved women in our histories of the 18th century Caribbean. Wedderburn's archive is, of course, much more modest in scope than these traditional repositories, but the circumstances of its assembly and the comparative nakedness of its purpose make it much more accommodating to our goal. It represents a rare opportunity for us to begin with what is said. As we'll see, in some cases, it becomes possible by cross-referencing the claims to truth made within Wedderburn's testimony with the bureaucratic records of the Anglican Church in Jamaican colonial state to verify the dismissed and silenced claims for recognition made by these women and their children using the very colonial apparatus that existed partly to silence them. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a project of posthumously rescuing the reputation of morally perfect women. On the contrary, Wedderburn's mother and grandmother appear in these accounts as anything but naive or passive, as British abolitionist accounts would have us believe. Nor are they shown to be militant leaders of collective armed resistance, nor assassins poisoning slaveholders, though such women certainly did exist. Rosanna and Talkee Amy rather appear as complex, unafraid, and frankly difficult women who never conceded an iota of their complex personhood to the predicament of their enslavement. But their agentic actions present in ways that are compromised and awkward, and sometimes even a little undignified. Their stubbornness and obstinacy and the stories they told about themselves were nevertheless inspirational sources of strength to their young charge throughout his life, allowing him to imagine himself as heir to their violent and rebellious tempers. Wedderburn was quite clear about his motivations for recording what happened to his mother and grandmother from their perspective. "I am now upwards of 60 years of age," he wrote at the beginning of the horrors of slavery, "and therefore I cannot long expect to be numbered amongst the living. But before I pass from this vale of tears, I deem it an act of justice to myself, to my children, and to the memory of my mother to say what I am and who were the authors of my existence." So we're going to start before the beginning. So when Wedderburn's parents first met around 1758, Rosanna was working as an enslaved lady in waiting to Basilia Douglas at the Grange estate in Hanover Parish, which is the red circle here. Wedderburn described Rosanna as occupying a relatively senior position within the household staff at the Grange. "My mother was a lady's maid," he wrote, "and had received an education which perfectly qualified her to conduct a household in the most agreeable manner." Rosanna's close and intimate access to Lady Douglas, and to a lesser extent also her husband, James Charles Sholto Douglas, the customs officer for Kingston, placed her in a relatively rarefied situation within the hierarchy of the household. Rosanna's work would not have just consisted of chores such as laundry, cleaning, and cooking, but also in caring for Lady Douglas at her toilette, for example, helping her to dress and make up her hair each morning. Enslaved ladies' maids were also frequently involved in caring for and even wet nursing the children, a practice Edward Long had fulminated against in typically vitriolic style. As Sasha Turner has demonstrated, women like Rosanna were often educated from childhood to take care of the lady of the house, and part of their labor could be to provide companionship and conversation for white women, Rosanna and Lady Douglas's apparently mutually affectionate relationship during this period is a good illustration of what Stoller famously termed the tense and tender ties of empire. The delegation of caring and emotional labor to enslaved women meant that planters were required to place a great deal of trust in women like Rosanna. As Lady Douglas's maid, she would also have enjoyed a slightly broader degree of latitude in her movement through the house and in deciding her own working schedule compared even to other domestic slaves. Rosanna would also have been well informed on Jamaican current affairs and politics through a close proximity to James Charles Sholto Douglas and his frequent high status visitors to the Grange estate. In 1758, one of these visitors, James Wedderburn, Esquire, noticed Rosanna as she served the tea. He and his elder brother John had recently come into possession of their family's estate at Blackheath in the neighbouring Westmoreland parish. James and John were likely known to the Douglases already, though, as they'd been practicing in the area as physicians to the enslaved for over a decade. In Robert Wedderburn's accounts, his father was by then already well known as a serial rapist of enslaved women. My father, he wrote, ranged through the whole of his household for his own lewd purposes, for they, being his personal property, cost nothing extra. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was endemic in 18th century Jamaica, but Robert's narrative suggests that his father was looking for something more than sex from Rosanna. It was commonplace for planters during this period to take on enslaved mistresses who would be favoured over other women in exchange for the performance of emotional reciprocity and domestic companionship. Some enslaved women were willing to agree to this type of relationship on the tacit understanding that they retain a degree of autonomy over their bodies, that is, a right to refusal, and a host of privileges for them and any children they might bear the planters, including the future prospect of manumission. The notorious sadist and serial sexual predator Thomas Thistlewood, for example, maintained an enslaved relationship with an enslaved woman named Fibber for over 34 years. Thistlewood named Fibber as his wife in his will, and he acknowledged and manumitted their son, Mulatto John. Now, James Wedderburn was well aware of this arrangement, as he'd regularly visited both the Egypt and Kendall plantations that Thistlewood oversaw in his capacity as the physician. Now, as Sasha Turner has pointed out, light-skinned mulatto women, especially those trained in domestic roles like Fibber and Rosanna, were especially valued as companions by white planters. Given what Robert later described as Rosanna's, quote, perfectly virtuous and chaste character before she met James, he might have seen her as a potentially good candidate for this type of privileged, if obviously profoundly coercive, relationship. However, Rosanna's chastity and virtue, combined with the position of confidence and trust that she'd carved out for herself with Lady Douglas, presented something of an impediment to James Wedderburn's plan to purchase her for his own emotional needs. As Robert puts it, his character was well known, and therefore he was obliged to go covertly and falsely to work. In Jamaica, slaves that are esteemed by their owners have generally the power of refusal, whether they will be sold to a particular planter or not. And my father was aware that if he offered to purchase her, he would meet with a refusal. Now, it's extremely difficult to verify this claim. On one hand, enslaved people obviously had no legislative protections regarding who they could and could not be sold to. As long as Lady Douglas and James Wedderburn both agreed to the sale, Rosanna would have had no legal basis to challenge it. However, as we've seen, well-educated domestic servants with in-demand skills often commanded considerable personal regard from slaveholders. Rosanna had lived with and served Lady Douglas for a very long time, and it was perfectly possible that a strong objection to being sold to James Wedderburn on the grounds that her chastity might be threatened would indeed be respected. In this instance, Robert Wedderburn's account suggests that Rosanna was able to leverage her personal accomplishments, professional skills, and intimate connections with her mistress in an attempt to protect herself from the potential for sexual violence. Nevertheless, James Wedderburn was, as his son put it, determined to have possession of her. and employed his solicitor, William Cruikshank, to buy Rosanna, nominally on behalf of another client. Only after the sale was finalized, sometime early in 1759, did Rosanna discover she would be taken to Wedderburn's plantation at Blackheath. This underhanded strategy clearly struck with Rosanna, and it became the originating narrative in a shared family history that she passed down to Robert and his siblings. As he recalled in 1824, I have often heard my mother express her indignation at this base and treacherous conduct of my father, a treachery the more base as it was so calm and premeditated. This betrayal also marked a shift in Rosanna's demeanor and conduct at work. She was placed in charge of keeping the house at Blackheath, but increasingly disgusted with James Wedderburn's behavior, she became uncooperative. In fact, she made such a nuisance of herself that even James's Scottish children, who had never even met her, heard all about her unruly disposition even years after she had left the estate. Robert's white half-brother, Andrew Colville, recalled about 60 years later that Rosanna apparently had so violent a temper, quote, that she was continually quarreling with the other servants and occasioning a disturbance in the house. It was not long before James had to bring in another servant, a woman named Esther Trotter, who was described as a free mulatto in her christening record, to assume superintendence over the house in Rosanna's place. Robert relates that Esther Trotter stigmatized Rosanna for her enslaved status, ordering her around and constantly insulting her. For Rosanna's part, she became increasingly intransigent toward James's sexual advances, and especially so after she gave birth to their first child in January 1760. The Anglican Church christening record for Robert's older brother James is an elliptical, fragmentary piece of evidence, one of only two places in the surviving colonial record that Rosanna's name appears at all. It simply reads, James Wedderburn, son of Rosanna, a mulatto woman, the property of James Wedderburn, by James Wedderburn, born January, baptized July 20th. Rosanna here appeared almost fenced in by the threefold repetition of the name James Wedderburn, the first indicating her 6-month-old son, and the second and third indicated James Sr.'s dual role in her life as the father of her child and the person who asserted the right of property over her and her issue. The sheer prominence of the name in this brief record raises several questions. Considering how much she despised him and resisted coming into his service, did Rosanna consent to naming her son after her rapist? Or was James so intent on coming to some kind of terms with her that he suggested that the child should take his name? Or did he choose it as a mark of his affection for the child? Perhaps he hoped that his firstborn son would take after him, a chip off the old block. On the other hand, perhaps this record is further evidence of Rosanna causing trouble for James Wedderburn. As many scholars have shown, both baptism and naming ceremonies were especially important to people in the especially important to people in the 18th century Black Atlantic for many reasons, and baptism in particular was often believed to strengthen claims for manumission. If Rosanna's son was christened into the Anglican Church with the name James Wedderburn, she might reason that he stood a better chance in any future suit for freedom. The records of the Jamaican Colonial Assembly are littered with the quick and dirty ad hoc emancipation acts proposed by white fathers who wanted their mixed-race sons to grow up as free men, but weren't willing to pay for them. As Daniel Livesey's recent work has shown, emancipated mixed-race children of slaveholders were sometimes sent to Britain to be educated, and this practice was, for whatever reason, more common for Scottish slaveholders in Jamaica, like James Wedderburn, than for their English counterparts. This was a significantly different future to a lifetime working on the plantation, and one of which Rosanna might well have dreamt for her son. Even if freedom was not her primary goal, ensuring that Wedderburn's paternity was properly recorded could strengthen any claim she might be able to make on him in the future for financial help in raising the child. Nevertheless, any hope that James may have held out James Sr. may have held out for a quasi-consensual relationship with Rosanna was doomed to disappointment. When she rapidly fell pregnant a second time, she became depressed and refused to work, quarrelling more and more with Trotter and the other servants at Blackheath. Again, Robert's retrospective account of the trouble she caused there suggests that she told him all about her rebellious actions and that they became part of a shared family story. Her younger son, Robert, clearly felt an affinity with this side of his mother's personality, and far from minimizing or making excuses for her violent temper, he seemed filled with pride. Insulted on one hand and degraded on the other, he wrote, "Was it likely that my poor mother could practice the Christian virtue of humility when her Christian master provoked her to wrath?" She shortly afterwards again became pregnant, and I have not the least doubt that but from her rebellious and violent temper during that period, that I have inherited the same disposition, the same desire to see justice overtake the oppressors of my countrymen. The situation at Blackheath was becoming intolerable. Eventually, Rosanna left, seeking asylum with James's older brother, Sir John Wedderburn. Seeing that she could not be convinced to return to Blackheath, James Sr. finally relented and agreed to sell Rosanna, then 5 months pregnant with Robert, back to Lady Douglas at the Grange estate in Hanover. Again and again throughout his adult life, Robert told the same story about his own narrow escape from a life of slavery. It was often how he introduced himself. The story went that when James sold Rosanna back to the Douglases, they had agreed between them that Robert would be free at birth. He first made this claim in print in 1817, but he repeated the story again during multiple public speeches in 1819, again in court when he was tried for seditious blasphemy in 1820, again in the horrors of slavery in 1824, twice, and again in his final published tract, an address to Lord Brougham and Vaux in 1831. This was clearly a significant part of his identity and an important part of the family history that Rosanna and Amy had imparted to him. However, as Nadine Hunt has discovered, this claim conflicts with the account provided by the colonial record, which suggests that Robert was in fact emancipated by purchase, along with his brother James, on the 5th of June, 1765, when Robert was about 3 years of age. So this is a copy of the emancipation certificate for James Jr. and Robert Wedderburn, dated 5th of June, 1765. Now, this was some time after Rosanna had been sold back to the Douglases, not at the point of sale. Now, it seems highly unlikely that Robert knew about this himself, since his point about being emancipated in utero by prior arrangement remained completely consistent over multiple texts published many years apart. I think that Rosanna was once again likely the key actor, both in securing her son's manumissions and in protecting Robert from the truth about his legal status during his early years. She'd made herself so difficult at Blackheath that James Wedderburn appeared to have wanted to get rid of her by any means. He'd involved himself, or at least tried to involve himself, with a woman who continued to refuse his advances and who had positioned herself expertly to pursue him for the financial support required to raise and care for his children. There are a few explanations for the deal that they came to. Perhaps James Sr. had enough affection for Robert and James Jr. to see to it that they did not grow up in slavery. Perhaps James Charles Sholto Douglas, who purchased Rosanna back on his wife's behalf, did not want to take on any additional enslaved people, and certainly not to rebellious and headstrong young boys. But it's equally possible that Rosanna negotiated with James Wedderburn directly to secure freedom for their boys. If he wanted to be free of this troublesome woman and her constant quarrelling, then this may have been her price. If this was indeed the case, as Robert's accounts suggest, then it was not outright resistance nor total compliance, but sheer obstinacy, being a difficult woman, that had secured Rosanna her desired outcome. Now, Rosanna must have been relieved to return to Lady Douglas's service, but the Battle of Wills with James Wedderburn had taken its toll on her physical and mental health. At 4 months old, Robert was forced to be weaned to save both mother and child, and he was delivered to his maternal grandmother, Talkee Amy, in Kingston to be raised. When Lady Douglas died in 1764, Rosanna remained in the service of her husband, James Sholto Douglas, for another year, during which the boys' manumission deal was negotiated. According to Robert, his father made an attempt to purchase her back through his attorney Cruikshank, but this time her refusal to go with him was successful. Rosanna was eventually sold on to a Dr. Campbell, by whom she was reputed to have another child named Elizabeth. While Rosanna never fully recovered her health following her time at Blackheath, she never made herself easier to live with for Campbell or any other slaveholder. And when Campbell's wife mistreated her, she resolved to starve herself, alarming both Campbells enough to agree to sell her on once more. Again, Rosanna had negotiated her own escape from an impossible situation by being willing to introduce emotional distress and dissonance into the slaveholding household. And even when Charles Boswell, her last recorded owner, committed the horrible outrage on a pregnant body that Robert first testified to in 1817, Rosanna never appears to have returned to the relatively pacifist demeanour she apparently embodied while serving Lady Douglas. She also appears to have been a fairly regular visitor to her mother and son in Kingston. Talkee Amy, Wedderburn's grandmother, Robert Wedderburn's grandmother, was another highly regarded woman within the enslaved community, and she ran a stall in Kingston's huge Sunday or Negro market, which was attended by up to 10,000 people every weekend. As well as trading on her own account, Talkee Amy sold a number of goods for her putative master, Joseph Payne, at the market, including, quote, cheese, checks, chintz, milk, gingerbread, etc., and also sold goods for other merchants as an agent, receiving a small commission for her troubles. As Winifred Brown Glaude has demonstrated, enslaved higgler women embodied important sites of contestation among Kingston's diverse populace, representing for some white planters an alarming intrusion into the traditionally male world of free commerce. Certainly, some higglers were able to use their skill in trading commodities to leverage meaningful forms of economic and indeed social independence, even if this does not always constitute a realistic challenge to enslavement. Yet, as Trevor Bernard has suggested, independent trade at the Kingston Sunday market could open avenues to renegotiate the limitations imposed on enslaved people by urban merchant slave owners. In this way, the slightly freer conditions of slavery in the city reflected the significant role played by the enslaved in the colonial economy. However, for Amy, it was not legitimate commerce, but Kingston's thriving black market in smuggled and contraband goods that enabled her the greatest leeway and personal freedoms. Amy's owner, Payne, was a smuggler, and she sold smuggled goods for him and other merchants to both free and enslaved black people alike at the Sunday market. Despite being a young child at the time, Robert remembered that, quote, though a slave, such was the confidence that the merchant of Kingston had in her honesty that she could be trusted to any amount. In fact, she was the regular agent for selling smuggled goods. The smuggling of contraband goods such as mahogany between Jamaica and especially the Spanish West Indies has long been recognized as an essential part of the economy, especially in port cities and especially in Kingston. Historically, this kind of smuggling was carried on as an open secret, but during the second half of the 18th century, and especially after the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, colonial officials began to take this issue increasingly seriously. In Kingston, the man in charge of cracking down on smuggling, incidentally, was James Charles Sholto Douglas, Rosanna's owner, though Robert never mentioned Talkee Amy getting into any trouble with him. What is clear, however, is that the ever greater levels of trust that Payne was required to place in her helped secure Talkee Amy in her position as a highly valued and even respected individual within his household and business operations. but smuggling contraband mahogany was not the only dirt she had on him. Towards the end of his life in 1831, when Amy was long dead, Robert claimed that she was involved, along with Payne and his wife, in the much more serious crime of smuggling fugitive slaves off the island. I recollect when I was a boy, he wrote, of knowing one Price, a white man who lived with my grandmother's mistress, and by her authority, she was to harbour such slaves as this Price had seduced to leave the country, end quote. If this was true, it not only spoke to the trust that the Paynes and their associates had placed in Amy, their lives were, to an extent, in her hands, but also to the enormous amount of power she could wield against them if she so chose. It's little surprise then that Robert recalled his grandmother as a formidable woman who did mostly as she pleased and was unafraid of white planters, and especially not his father. One of the first things he noticed about her was that, quote, no woman was perhaps better known in Kingston than my grandmother by the name of Talkee Amy, signifying a chattering old woman. James Wedderburn, Sr., who must have thought he had washed his hands of his illegitimate children once he'd sold Rosanna, had not counted on the audacity of this so-called chattering old woman. She turned up at Blackheath one day in the late 1760s with a very young Robert in tow. The memory of the exchange stuck with him. I never saw my dear father but once in the island of Jamaica when I went with my grandmother to know if he meant to do anything for me, his son. Giving her some abusive language, my grandmother called him a mean Scotch rascal, thus to desert his own flesh and blood, and declared that as she'd kept me hitherto, so she would yet, without his paltry assistance. Both Diana Patten and Miles Ogborne have recently explored how insults and insubordinate speech were important means by which enslaved women undermined planter authority in 18th century Jamaica. Evidently, few things discomfited men like James Wedderburn more than a black woman with a voice. Robert remembered this particular exchange of words as a moment of real triumph. His grandmother, formidable, trading insults with his ne'er-do-well, irresponsible father, and by anyone's account, getting the better of him. But Amy may have been known as Talkee Amy for another reason. Robert recorded several times that she was whipped by a young man whom she'd helped to raise because he believed that she had, quote, bewitched Payne's smuggling ship, causing him to be apprehended by the Spanish. This was clearly an accusation of Obeah, which had been explicitly outlawed in Jamaica since the law for the better ordering of Negroes was passed following the suppression of Tacky's Revolt in 1761. Obeah, a religious practice derived from West African animist beliefs, had featured prominently during Tacky's War as both an inspiration for the insurgent enslaved and as a means of military organization, with Obeah men and women serving as leaders and spiritual advisors during the conflict. As Randy Brown has noted, even in peacetime, Obeah practitioners commanded possessions of immense authority among the enslaved in Jamaica. Patten, meanwhile, has explored how the legislation outlawing Obeah, quote, assimilated a range of African practices to the early modern European crime of witchcraft, but also produced a conceptual space between them by attempting to outlaw the practice of rather than the belief in Obeah. This reflected anxieties over both the social function of Obeah in challenging white hegemony, but also an often unspoken unease over whether there was actually something to this practice after all. As Ogborne has suggested, one part of Obeah practice was concerned with communion with the recently deceased and the spirits of ancestors or deities. Sensationalized accounts featuring both published slaveholder memoirs and fictional depictions of Obeah tended to fix on the material elements of rituals, such as the use of blood, eggshells, bones, and feathers. But those on the ground in Jamaica knew that different forms of speech, chanting, singing, and speaking in tongues, were equally definitive components of these deeply subversive forms of spiritual expression. In this context, the name Talkee Amy seems not to merely signify a chattering old woman, as Robert suggested, but an interlocutor between worlds, whose powers and influence were unknown and potentially dangerous. Many whites in Jamaica were afraid of Obeah men and women. In 1799, the former planter Benjamin Moseley, for example, noted without any apparent irony that Obeah women, so-called Obeah women, were able to control the weather, and in Kingston market, they would, quote, sell foul winds for inconstant mariners, dreams and fantasies for jealousy, vexation and pains in the heart for perfidious love, and so on. When Payne was captured by the Spanish authorities while smuggling mahogany, his nephew and Amy's new owner blamed her for hexing the ship and flogged her severely. Now, in all of his accounts of his grandmother's punishment under suspicion of Obeah, Wedderburn remained resolute that there could be no such thing. Indeed, contrary to the spirit of the Obeah laws of 1761, he characterized European anxieties over these practices as a superstitious belief in witchcraft, inverting kind of traditional racialized narratives about the superstitions, supposed superstitions of Africans. So in 1817, for instance, he demanded of his readers to repent ye Christians for flogging my aged mother before my face when she was accused, aged grandmother before my face when she was accused of witchcraft by a silly European boy. When he himself stood convicted of seditious blasphemy in 1820, he explained to a courtroom exactly why he did not believe in the existence of witches. His impression, he said, on this subject arose from the circumstance of seeing his aged grandmother, a poor black slave in the island of Jamaica, several times most cruelly flogged by order of her master, a white man and a Christian, for being a witch. Now, as he, when a child, had frequently picked her pockets of sixpences and shillings, he was well convinced that she could not possess the qualities and powers attributed to witches, or she must have detected his petty depredations. One is tempted to speculate here that Amy, like many indulgent grandmothers, was perfectly aware of these petty depredations, but allowed the young Robert to take a few pennies from her now and again as a form of indulgence. In any case, the whole affair with the smuggling ship was another example of the tyranny of slavery that was seared into the family's collective memory and repeated on numerous occasions to Robert before finally he published the details as an adult. Okay, so just to conclude, I'll stop sharing my screen because I've run out of my slides here. So scholars have long expressed their dissatisfaction with what I'll call the survival resistance dyad, in which enslaved women's actions are all accounted for primarily as responses to the abstract system of slavery. This has to some extent been an inevitable outcome of our necessary reliance on either a colonial archive that explicitly sought to reduce enslaved women to depersonalized units of economic production and demographic reproduction, or an abolitionist archive that implicitly sought to render them, sometimes in rather voyeuristic terms, as inarticulate and helpless victims of planter brutality. Neither of these archives are equipped to record enslaved women's subjectivities, and they're often very subtle negotiations with planters in pursuit of their own agendas and objectives. But enslaved women were able to generate archival accounts of their own lives, albeit in the usually ephemeral form of oral testimonies passed on to children and grandchildren. In Rosanna and Amy's case, their son was able to relate and publish some of these stories, translating them into a form that remains accessible to historical researchers. By reading these second-generation accounts as a radical counter-archive, we're able to glimpse some of the nuances of how enslaved women secured their objectives in ways that confound straightforward categorization as either mere survival or overt resistance. In particular, this counter-archive emphasizes that being rude, obstinate, stubborn, and generally difficult could sometimes enable highly trusted women to leverage very significant and expensive concessions from slaveholders without exposing themselves or their loved ones to the existential risks associated with outright and declared insurrection. Male planters like James Wedderburn Sr. often sought emotional as well as sexual intimacy with relatively elite enslaved women like Rosanna, and they imagined themselves as being able to obtain both by coercion. As Robert's accounts of his mother's violent and rebellious wars of attrition against both his father and Dr. Campbell demonstrate, women whose reciprocation was highly desired found themselves able to disquiet planters' home lives and introduce constant and distressing disruption into the home. For planters disappointed in their hopes of a reciprocal emotional connection, it was sometimes simply easier to give these difficult women what they wanted, especially when what they wanted was to be sent elsewhere. However, sexual encounters with these women engendered further obligations in the form of mixed-race children, which could continue to haunt planters many years after their initial infatuations had faded. Older women like Talkee Amy, on the other hand, were able to make themselves difficult in very different ways. The degree of respect and trust that Amy was able to build up in Kingston society, both as a smuggler's agent and as a rumoured Obeah woman, enabled her the vastly greater degree of latitude in directing her own movements than the majority of enslaved people enjoyed at this time, even in the city. This, as much as their undoubtedly formidable personal character, emboldened Amy to further press her daughter's claims on James Wedderburn to provide financially for his children, powerfully transgressing colonial racial hierarchies to insult him directly to his face. Even though she was unsuccessful in this instance, the story of the confrontation, like the stories passed down by the indignant and sometimes bellicose Rosanna, emboldened their son Robert to view insubordination and disrespect for authority figures as his birthright. The very recent memory of violent insurrection in Jamaica in this period provides an important context for explaining how these women were able to achieve so much simply by making themselves awkward. Enslaved smuggling agents, Obeah practitioners, and domestic servants with access to planters' intimate lives represented a significant weak spot in the colonial regime. In the aftermath of Tacky's War, while conspiracies and insurrections were constantly being uncovered all over the island, people like James Wedderburn Sr., James Charles Sholto Douglas, and Joseph Payne were forced to double down on the level of trust they placed in women like Rosanna and Amy. This narrowing down of planter choices had the effect of opening up new, though subtle, negotiating positions for the enslaved, while at the same time, as Rosanna discovered when she was flogged under, when Amy discovered when she was flogged under accusations of witchcraft, it could also frighten slaveholders into hasty and uncalled for repressive action. As a child, Robert Wedderburn watched as these tensions played out, remembering especially the injustices that his mother and grandmother underwent, and perhaps imagining the possibility of another uprising in which justice could finally overtake the oppressors of his countrymen. Indeed, he ended his 1824 account of his mother and grandmother's lives by promising a future publication which would examine, quote, the treatment of the blacks in the West Indies and the prospect of a general rebellion and massacre there from my own experience, end quote. As we'll see in the next lecture, the justice of violent retribution for the horrors of slavery was to become one of his core beliefs as he left the care of these difficult, inspiring women and began his own insurrectionary career in the imperial metropolis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, man. That was fabulous. Excellent, excellent. Walter, could you lead off our discussion?
Absolutely. That was fascinating, Ryan, and I think architecturally and intellectually beautifully done. I guess I guess I want to ask a kind of a complicated question that, in a way, is meant as an appreciation of the architecture of the paper, but also just to try to clarify some of the terms. I mean, so you start off with the critique of the archive, and it seems like you for the moment at least, sort of accept for the moment Hartman and Fuentes' kind of astringent reading of the possibilities of the archive. And you make a little bridge, and the little bridge is imagining Robert Wedderburn seeing this image of the pregnant woman being flogged and not being titillated, but seeing his mother, right? And so I want to ask you about that first, and then I'm going to expand that. So I want to ask both I mean, what about others? Right? Do we need, doesn't your paper actually urge us towards a critique of this astringent reading of the archive, the idea that all anyone would see looking at that image is an image effectively of their own imperial desires? And weren't there other ways to look at that than seeing one's own mother, other empathetic, politically activating ways? The other question that I have then is about the women that you evoke. And I think you evoke them beautifully, but I think you evoke them differently in a way that I'd like to hear you talk about. That your evocation of, then the question is, if we are going to imagine trying to join Robert Wedderburn on that kind of bridge, right, towards imagining this world, it seems to me like you have two different, not entirely separated, but distinct ways of doing that. Of imagining and conveying, of even amplifying the subjectivity of these enslaved women. One, in the case of Rosanna, is basically biographical and caricaturological, right? You're kind of using the conventions of 19th century novels to understand her, the difficult woman who has personal conflicts. And her life is shaped around that kind of line. You understand Talkee Amy differently, it seems to me, that you use Talkee Amy differently. You use her more like a kind of an avatar, that she's your guide. She guides us through a world that we wouldn't otherwise see. She functions more like an example in social history. And so I guess I want to ask you a whole bunch of questions about the stakes of those choices, right? The stake the stake of using Robert Wedderburn as the sole way across that kind of bridge of misunderstanding, rather than imagining that those images create a possibility for a world of alliances and understanding. And then the stakes of the way that you represent Amy and Rosanna. And all of that really is a way of drawing out for myself, and I hope everyone else, how enormously thought through this seems to me to be, and thought through to the point that so few academics ever reach, which is thought through to the point where complicated ideas can actually be presented lucidly, for which I commend you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, those two incredibly kind of thought-provoking questions, and very useful questions as well, as I continue to kind of think about this as sort of a work in progress piece, or some sort of current research. So I think I'll begin. Oops. Okay. I think so. I'll take them in order, I guess. That the first sort of question about that opening example, and that our starting point with the John Fairbairn kind of publications. This is sort of a very difficult to find type of cheap print culture that I think represents slavery at a slightly different register for a poor metropolitan readership compared to the types of representation of slavery that we might be more used to using in kind of cultural histories of abolitionism in Britain. Now, I think it would be a mistake to kind of characterize that cheaper literature as being in some way kind of more salacious, or in some way kind of just a less sophisticated or less sensitive representation of enslaved women compared to sort of official, anti-slavery society produced literature. I don't think that it's kind of intentionally exploitative necessarily. I think that the effect that is produced by changing some of that kind of elite discourses and some of those accounts into a commodity that is attractive for a working class readership by adding lots of exclamation marks and bright kind of brightly colored hand-drawn etchings, and in doing stuff with fonts and kerning and text that make it kind of seem a little bit sort of more tabloidy to look at as a cultural artifact. I think that they have that effect, but actually the way that working class or poorer readers encounter these sources is not monolithic any more so than middle class readers' responses to these texts. So I think that you know, there's no kind of fixed reading. There's no way we could prove how these texts are kind of received and read by their intended readership. But I do think that the image of enslaved women in particular that is sort of bequeathed to the archive by these types of cultural artifacts are by necessity two-dimensional. These women tend to be frozen in the moment of a form of kind of degradation or pain, and that if that's all we've got to go on, then we're required to do extremely difficult and sensitive work of the sort that Marisa Fuentes, I think, has done excellently, and Laura Stoller kind of talks about in terms of another type of archive, the sort of colonial archives. But I use it as just as a moment of contact between Robert Wedderburn's very idiosyncratic approach to representing enslaved women, and to try to kind of represent their representations of their own experience. So it's like an echo of the reality that we get. But at least Robert Wedderburn was in some sense kind of working collaboratively with the women themselves in producing this, whereas somebody like Fairbairn is really an echo of a colonial, or an echo of a colonial record, which was itself kind of translated through a parliamentary abolitionist. So I suppose I was wanting to use that as our way in, just as a way to think about where Wedderburn sits in the market, where he is coming from, I suppose, and what makes his contribution a kind of unique one, and one that I think is actually historiographically and narratologically kind of valuable. Now, a big part of that is the way that he characterizes Rosanna and Amy. So, you know, again, I kind of try to be sensible in terms of the claims that I'm able to make with, you know, the legitimacy, if you want, of this source, or the kind of specialness of this source. Clearly, Wedderburn has to trade in a certain extent in sort of archetypes in showing us who Rosanna and Amy are, and in both cases, you know, they're represented partly as a kind of an archetypical difficult woman. I think Talkee Amy kind of comes across, there's an element of the kind of, you know, formidable Jamaican grandmother figure, sort of stereotype almost, in Talkee Amy, in the way that she comes out and that she marches this child, over to his father and says, you know, what are you going to do for your son then? So that is, I suppose, a inherent characteristic of treating Wedderburn's work as a kind of radical counter-archive in this way, is that you have to accept that that's what the characterization is, and that's how these women kind of appear in these sources, in order to kind of to gain any sorts of insight that you can from them. In a similar way, I suppose, to how, I'm sorry, I was sort of thinking through your question as I'm answering it, in a similar way to how we might look at sort of more traditional archives, and try to read along the grain of those. It's possible to sort of read along the grain of the Wedderburn archive by kind of cross-referencing it in its factual details, and trying to set some dates and names to sometimes quite impressionistic statements that Wedderburn makes, but then he'll give you just enough of a fact to find your way in, to pin it into a kind of chronology, or a map, or or whatever. So yeah, I mean, that's not a terribly focused sort of answer, but I suppose what I'm trying to do here is to honor Wedderburn's desire to do justice to what his mother and grandmother went through, and to kind of run with them as though they run with these accounts as though they represent the truth, in the way that we're really quite comfortable doing with the colonial archive. And so I guess the way that the characters come out reflects the nature of that archive in the same way. But maybe there's further to go, right? We can actually challenge Robert's depiction of them, and perhaps his responses to things like the Fairbairn illustration as well. Thank you.
Great, Abby. Are you curating?
I am. Am I on screen? Oh, there I am. That was fascinating. And it touched on a lot of things that I used to think about a long time ago. And we do have some audience questions, but if I may take the opportunity to ask just a couple of questions of my own. I'm wondering, I mean, one thing that I used to look at a lot was how the representation of violence against female bodies deflected attention away from violence against male bodies. And I'm wondering if you see that in these accounts too, because Wedderburn is, and it's really important to represent violence against female bodies. I would never, ever say otherwise, but is there any impetus in his doing that, in his doing that, is he trying to cast the gaze away from what's happening to men, to violence against men as well? And I'm not talking about necessarily sexual violence against men, but just the violence of enslavement against men.
Before you answer, my question is similar, so let's tie them together. Could you compare Frederick Douglass's depiction of the beating of Aunt Hester and the narrative, the role it plays in his narrative, with this beating? It's not necessarily that they're connected, but they do depict violence against two women and ostensible family members, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very curious if you can answer Abby's question and then segue into how this functions narratively, politically, as opposed to Douglass.
Yeah, so, well, again, I think that this kind of, that works really well with what Walter's question was asking, in a sense, which is, I suppose, to sort of situate this corpus of work that Wedderburn produces between 1817 and 1831 within a kind of, within its, the historically situated in its own context. I think that certainly in the 1820s, when The Horrors of Slavery is produced, which is the text that contains the most about these two women, violence against women in slavery is a particular topic. It's a particular strategy that's being pursued by the kind of mainstream abolitionist movement, but it's also the field of discourse that is kind of being moved into by these very sort of cheap, sort of low class, low status types of literature. And this is precisely the market that Wedderburn's going for. Does that detract to get away from the question of violence against men? I over the past sort of few weeks, I sort of reread all of Wedderburn's work. There isn't a particular emphasis on violence against men within slavery. There's a particular emphasis on insurrection and uprising and violence committed against slaveholders by enslaved men, but enslaved men really don't feature as being victimized in perhaps the same way as they do in The Horrors of Slavery, as women do in The Horrors of Slavery, sorry. although we don't also, at the same time, you know, we don't see the kind of complex negotiations of, I hesitate to say agency, but, you know, the complex kind of negotiations of limits that we do with Rosanna and Amy, who come across as kind of the most kind of well-rounded individual enslaved people that Wedderburn is interested in representing. So, and I suppose, yeah, that sort of speaks to the Frederick Douglass piece as well, is that, you know, he's producing texts to be read in a particular moment by a particular group of people, and that there's a strategically playing into broader narratives of the abolition movement that he's doing, both in the way that he represents these women, but also in the way that he represents violence and the direction of violence as being kind of particularly towards women and not particularly towards men. So I think you're quite right, Abby. It could be a case that he's deflecting this question towards somewhere where that he feels will be most kind of productive for his political agenda, particularly as we'll see tomorrow and on Wednesday, he's engaged largely in rabble rousing the working classes in England by inspiring them with, you know, the image of the enslaved in the West Indies, you know, taking their kind of political rights by force as such. So the sort of potential for disempowerment by seeing them as physically harmed or victims of physical violence might not be actually productive to what he's attempting to achieve by creating what I'm calling this archive.
Yeah, thank you. That gives a lot. Thank you so much. I'm just thinking and thinking, but let's turn to our audience we do have a few questions from the audience, and please keep them coming. We actually have Adam Muhammad, who is currently writing a dissertation on Wedderburn that is called Populist, Pragmatist, Preacher, or Pimp, Analyzing the Radical Politics of Reverend Robert Wedderburn. And his first question is, would you say, given the tract, would you say in the tract addressed to Lord Brougham, that McCalman's assertion of Wedderburn as an unfaltering anti-establishmentarian abolitionist is largely incorrect? So that's, I think, a fairly specific question, but I think you could use it to address some larger issues that you bring up.
Yeah, definitely. So, Adam, is it?
Yes.
Adam,
yes.
I'm so glad you're doing a dissertation on Wedderburn. Once it's marked and you get your mark back and everything, please send it over. I would love to read it. So email me. That text, I'm going to talk about that a lot more on Wednesday. So Wedderburn's final text in 1831, an address to Lord Brougham and Vaux, really represents Wedderburn, I think, and this again sort of links to what I was just saying about these things being produced at a particular time for a particular purpose. I think that this represents a time in Wedderburn's life when he is destitute of friends and hasn't got any money left and is out of step with the rest of the radical movement. He's seen as being unrespectable and being, you know, sort of yesterday's man, basically. And all the kind of British radicals that he used to hang out with are now all engaged in, you know, the march of the mind and sort of more strategic types of political activism than the sort of insurrectionary millenarianism that Wedderburn is known for. So I think that the address to Lord Brougham and Vaux is a kind of lurch towards trying to stay relevant. And that's why in that text, he comes out with this anti-abolitionist thing. It's a complete reversal of what he's kind of known for and from the majority of the stuff that I'm looking at today. So yeah, I'll talk a lot more about that on Wednesday, but I think it's really a matter of historical contingency, basically, is that Wedderburn needs this text to be a success, and he is kind of grasping for a kind of relevancy, and he thinks this is the way to go about it. I don't think that undoes his earlier radicalism. I don't think that necessarily means that we have to kind of sort of abandon him or lose track of him any more than, as your dissertation title suggests, his involvement in running a brothel means that we have to sort of set him aside as being kind of too compromised to be useful. I think actually just by paying really close attention to circumstances and to contexts, we can make sense of why he made the decisions that he did, even the bad decisions that he did. And we can continue to use that type of work, not just to inform historical scholarship, but also as an inspiration for kind of social justice movements today as well.
I think Adam actually had a second question, and he also asked if he could contact you. So you've just given him permission to contact you. His your email address is available at the University of Exeter's website. So you can, Adam, you can find him there. But I think that Adam's second question, and then we'll get on to a few others, kind of address what you're saying, because he's referring here to Acts Volume 1. He says Wedderburn seems to propose two methods for the self-emancipation of the enslaved. The first consists of the use of passive nonviolent resistance, such as sleeping late. The second, addressing those who love liberty, characterizes a violent call for bloodshed and revolution. How and why was Wedderburn able to encompass such different assertions within the first volume of Acts Laid to the Root?
Yeah. So I think Eric Pensek's done a really good job of situating situating the Acts Laid to the Root, Wedderburn's 1817 periodical, in the context of broader radical kind of discursive traditions. And so in that, the Acts Laid to the Root is made up of all these articles, which may or appear like they may have been written by different people, but they're all by Wedderburn, sometimes pretending to be different people, sometimes pretending to be people writing to him to complain about stuff he's written, or sometimes pretending to be his half sister Elizabeth Campbell, who I mentioned briefly here, narrating the progress of this kind of insurrection that it didn't happen in Jamaica, of this, well, not insurrection, but of this these events that didn't happen in Jamaica. So I think that the what's the word I'm after, like polyvocal narrations that you see there, they're actually part of like a broader tradition of early 19th century radical writing, and Wedderburn is able to kind of encompass a range of different kind of visions for how the revolution might take place in Jamaica. And so I guess it would make sense for him, when he's addressing enslaved people, to say that they should go slow and to pursue a kind of a non-violent route towards a revolutionary objective. But then when he talks about the burning cane fields and slaying men, women, and children, he's addressing planters there. And actually the utility of assuming a very menacing stance to a slaveholder is kind of self-evident to radical movements in 1817. But Wedderburn is also aware of how race operates in Britain in this time. And so kind of encouraging enslaved people to be kind of ferocious and violent actually would be counterproductive, again, to the kind of universalist vision that he's got. So it's about horses for courses, really, about framing his approach to his imagined readership, but also to fit the imagined author that he is sort of pretending to be within each of these different articles that appear in the same publication.
It's so interesting thinking of him, Skip mentioned Frederick Douglass, of course, who we're very used to, hearing about as the most photographed man of the American of the 19th century, and the way he he used his own image and to manipulate the public, or he manipulated his own self-representation. But I think we don't usually hear about him as manipulating the market or the marketplace of ideas, which is what he was really doing. But as I understand what you're talking about, Wedderburn as someone, who had all of these interventions in the press, we think of the press as the marketplace. So it's just, it's interesting to me to think about these things together. And of course, Douglas is a little bit later, but how one kind of goes into the other. I wanted actually, well, there are two questions that came in about the representation of women, and I think they work really well together. But I know, Professor Johnson, you need to leave soon, so I don't want to put you on the spot. But if you have another question that you would like to ask before before you have to take
No,
your
I mean,
leave.
I think I doubled mine up. And so I kind of put them all, I did what I did not do was more a comment than a question. So, I can, that's the only sin that I did not commit in my question.
Thank you for not sinning, Walter.
Right. Okay, well, then we will get back to our audience then. I like that idea of the kind of jumping off the Zoom cliff to picture our audience. But so we do have two questions. One, and I thought maybe you could address them together. Kimberly Tisdale is taken by the idea that, by behaving in a difficult manner, women were allotted a certain level of freedom, as you say, as you mentioned. After Talkee Amy and the others were forced to stop their witchcraft practices, they were still feared, but did they retain a level of autonomy because of that, the fear of them? And kind of connected to that, I think, the whole picture, Megan Jendrzik asks, should we treat the use of stories and especially images of violence against enslaved women as another and lasting exploitation of these women? So we've got these, the kind of two sides of that, the image of empowerment and autonomy that makes Talkee Amy such a fascinating figure here, but also this idea of exploitation, which I think goes back to Walter's early, to the question that he opened with. So if you could perhaps, talk about that whole picture, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Can I? I'll take Megan's question first about that question about, well, by in a way, by sort of reproducing images of the exploit of women suffering, is Wedderburn in some senses kind of exploiting that in terms of the kind of market expediency that we were talking about just now. And indeed, are we kind of doomed to be repeating that sort of textual violence by repeating, by reproducing those images? And I was a little bit uneasy actually with showing that first kind of very lurid kind of graphic picture at the beginning for this exact reason. I was a little bit uncomfortable with it, which is why I only sort of left it up for a few seconds. Because I think that I do take very seriously what Fuentes suggests, which is that we are in some senses sort of complicit in reinscribing that type of violence, and that it's almost unavoidable if we want to sort of speak about women, to be or to confront our complicity in the reproduction of these images as historians. Fuentes doesn't see a way around that. I can't say that I necessarily am faring any better in terms of finding a way around that. And I suppose it requires a degree of, it requires a degree of, assuming the responsibility for the kind of colonial records that we've inherited. We don't have to assume sort of guilt for those depictions and representations, but we have inherited them, and so we're responsible for them, I think. And we have to just own, well, in my view, I think we have to just kind of own the nature of those records, and wherever possible, kind of make our interventions, to be in the service of redress for the wrongs that they kind of depict and that they try to sort of kind of set in stone. So yes, that's not a satisfactory answer, but I don't think there is a satisfactory answer to that problem. So apart from simply just kind of bearing the weight of that, I suppose. Kim's question about Kimberly, is it Kim or Kimberly?
Kimberly here.
Kimberly, yeah, Kimberly's question about difficult women and kind of retaining the levels of sort of freedom or the levels of latitude for additional freedom that could come through not necessarily fear, but perhaps a kind of dread of having to deal with them. I think when women make themselves difficult and make themselves, if you like, more trouble than they're worth, I think that there's actually a really overlooked form of, I guess, resistance that doesn't actually take aim, you know, at the institution of slavery. It doesn't sort of oppose enslavement in a kind of meaningful way, but it does mean that they're able to open up these new avenues. It gives them sort of options where I think that, you know, the intention was that they would have none. And so we see this happen after kind of Rosanna leaves Robert's kind of Robert's view, you know, is that she's constantly kind of being sold on. Nobody really wants to own this enslaved woman, but she has incredibly valuable skills, and you know, she's obviously kind of highly sought after as a servant. But on the other hand, you know, she's sort of a nightmare to live with. So she kind of disrupts the expectation that she'll introduce this kind of emotional support into slaveholders' homes. And uses that difficulty, uses that awkwardness and obstinacy to, you know, to secure the best outcome in a severely limited field of outcomes for herself. And I think that that's well worth kind of acknowledging. And Wedderburn doesn't care that she's awkward and difficult and doesn't pretend that she's perfect, which is the thing that I think attracts me most to his depiction of these women, actually, is that they don't come across as being, you know, accommodating in any way, shape or form. And he loves that about them. And he thinks that he inherited that from them. So that's why I wanted to focus on them today as well.
Are there any other accounts of women, you know, that are of this type? I mean, he's writing about his mother and grandmother, and Skip mentioned, you know, Douglas's representation later in the American context. But have you unearthed any other such stories in the archives that kind of that do bring these individual women to life who aren't able necessarily to represent themselves, but are being represented by journalists or abolitionists or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, one account that springs to mind in an even more kind of problematic and challenging form of archive is Fibber, from Thistlewood's diaries. Thanks, Walter. Who, you know, talking about creating a nasty atmosphere in the house, right? I mean, Fibber, so Thomas Thistlewood, who, you know, historians of slavery, particularly historians of the Caribbean, know Thistlewood extremely well, because he kept this extremely dispassionate kind of record of thousands of instances of sexual violence, but also of kind of extreme sadistic violence against men. And Fibber comes through in this very, very graphic and upsetting archive, as you know, today Fibber was sullen, or she refused me, and she was, you know, and so he kind of records her not as doing anything that constitutes resistance, but as simply being a particular way that kind of really disrupted what he wanted life to be like for himself and what he wanted their relationship to be like. And, you know, so she so I think that Fibber is quite an interesting figure there. In, I think, so Trevor Bernard, who's written a very good biography of Thistlewood, sort of suggests that she makes her way in the world, if you like, through compliance. But I actually think that what she does isn't always compliance. What she does is sometimes difficulty and awkwardness, and that actually, you know, belongs somewhere else on the spectrum, if you like, of that kind of dyadic, like survival on one hand and resistance on the other. I think that there's this whole spectrum of kind of actions and decisions and ways of simply existing, creating atmosphere that aren't really captured necessarily in that sort of traditional dyadic model of enslaved women's behaviors.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think just as a reminder, one of our audience members, Serena Safer, is reminding, she says, Rosanna, I think this is worth stating here. Rosanna may be an example of a difficult enslaved or of an enslaved woman that can secure the best outcome for herself. But we need to remember that there are many others who, through being, even being difficult, seeming to, be able to negotiate certain things, did not escape being beaten, tortured, raped, and killed. So even as you're saying, that's kind of the typical way that we tend to see, the typical outcome that we see. It was the typical outcome in many, I shouldn't laugh when I'm saying that, but I'm not laughing when I'm saying that. Please forgive me for that. But anyway, I think as we're winding down, I'm wondering if today your one-word title was testimony for your lecture. What can we look forward to hearing about tomorrow?
Tomorrow's lecture, the one-word subtitle is illegitimacy. So tomorrow we'll be looking at Wedderburn's early period as a ultra-radical in London, and how the question of personal and political illegitimacy affected the development of his radical outlook up to 1820.
Wonderful.
I can't wait. So Abby, is that
I think we are, yes, I think it's 5:33, and I think we have used our questions.
Ryan? Fabulous job.
You have
Fabulous lecture. Really wonderful. Everybody, let's give it up for Ryan Hanley.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Thank you so much for the questions as well. It was really, really thoughtful. And again, this is a work in progress. So I'm gonna, these are so useful, the ways to think about how we can use this material. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, we will see you tomorrow in person, virtually and in person.
Right, exactly.
Okay,
Right.
cheers. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.